The wind that swept across the lowlands of eastern Texas was dry, carrying with it the scent of parched soil, dying grass, and distant cattle. It curled around the rusted fence posts and creaked through the warped boards of what had once been a modest but proud farmhouse, now nothing more than a memory scorched into the dirt. The woman who had lived there, Lucia Marsh, stood at the edge of the empty lot with a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a small thermos of black coffee in the other. Her truck still idled behind her, tailgate open, as if the day were just beginning. And in a way, it was. The beginning of something that would reshape her life entirely. 2 days ago, she had driven into the city to pick up medical supplies for her aging mare and a new water regulator for the irrigation valve. She didn't expect to be gone more than 48 hours. She hadn't bothered to tell anyone. She didn't need to. Her land sat at the end of a private gravel road with no neighbors for nearly 2 miles in any direction. The road wasn't even marked on newer county maps. It was the kind of place you didn't come upon by accident, and Lucia liked it that way. Her late husband, Charlie, had always said that some people built lives for themselves and others just waited to see what kind of life would be handed to them. They had built theirs, piece by piece, post by post, acre by acre. That morning, when Lucia turned onto the road and noticed the dust wasn't quite the color it used to be, she knew something was wrong. When she saw the tire tracks in the gravel, deep ones from treads wider than any pickup or tractor they owned, her stomach started to knot. But she never expected this. Where her home had stood for the last 22 years, there was now only a flattened lot, scorched grass around the perimeter, and fragments of cinder block and torn siding poking from the soil like broken bones. Even the stone marker that had stood at the gate, the one Charlie had carved himself with their initials and the year they'd bought the land, was gone, as if it had never existed. No equipment remained. No sign of who had come or why. Lucia didn't scream. She didn't even blink. She simply set the thermos on the hood of the truck, walked forward until her boots crunched over the churned-up soil where her kitchen once stood, and stared. A portion of the old cement foundation was still visible, stained by oil or diesel. She recognized it immediately. The edge of the pantry. She had painted that spot bright blue once, then covered it with shelving. Now it was just a stain. She didn't have to ask what had happened. She already knew. Somebody had ordered the house razed. Someone with the authority, or at least the appearance of it, had sent heavy machinery down a private road and onto deeded land, destroyed a home, and left nothing but dust in their wake. There was no warning, no permit posted, no court summons or tax lien, nothing. Just absence. Just silence. Lucia pulled out her phone, took a few slow steps back and snapped one photo, not because she thought it would help, but because her mind needed something to anchor this moment to. Then she turned her eyes toward the far side of the property, to the shed, the one structure still intact, or at least partially. The door was hanging off its hinges like someone had kicked it in. Her stomach clenched tighter. She hurried across the uneven ground, her breath catching as she neared what had been the tool shed and feed store. The walls were caved in, as if someone had driven a forklift through them, and the smell, sour, chemical, hot, was unmistakable. Fuel. A pile of burned debris sat smoldering in one corner, among it the twisted remnants of what had been a rainwater filtration tank, part of the gravity-fed system Charlie had installed before his health failed. The tank fed into the old irrigation pipes which ran downhill to a subterranean water main, a critical artery that supplied not only their land, but also the entire farming cooperative of the Eastern District. The pipe crossed her property. Everyone knew it. It had been a point of quiet tension for years, especially since Charlie's passing when she chose not to formally join the board of the district. She never refused access to the main, never cut off supply, but she'd made one thing clear to them in every polite but firm letter, that her land was private, and she did not authorize development, installation of new control systems, or alterations without written consent. The cooperative, unofficially led by a woman named Karen Bledsoe, had tolerated her independence for a while, but tolerance wasn't the same as respect. Lucia had sensed the shift over the past year. First came the mailers urging her to modernize her land use and join the collective. Then came the property visits by clipboard-wielding inspectors who claimed to be surveying flood zones, but were really measuring access points and soil depth. Then the contractor trucks began parking along the county road just beyond her tree line, idle for hours at a time, and then silence. Weeks of it, until now. She opened the twisted door of the shed and stepped inside. Her hand brushed the wall where her husband's tool rack used to be. Everything was gone, taken or destroyed. All the wiring ripped from the walls. Even the emergency breaker panel that controlled the irrigation valve had been smashed in. That was the real reason for the demolition, she realized. The home had never been the target. It was the access to the water main, the last physical barrier to full control. But they'd made a critical mistake. They assumed she'd leave. They assumed that by wiping out her house and hiding behind vague legal threats, they'd break her. Lucia stepped outside and looked up at the sun. It was almost noon. Her coffee was cold by now, but she didn't care. She went back to the truck, opened the glove box, and retrieved a small, rusted metal key. Not for the house, not for the shed, but for the subterranean hatch located near the creek bed, hidden beneath a patch of wild blackberry vines. Charlie had buried it 20 years ago and marked it with a smooth, flat stone. She'd walked past it 1,000 times and never thought much of it. It was the original manual override valve, the one that bypassed every electronic control, every smart system, and every wireless node the co-op had installed over the past 5 years. As she stood there in the clearing, staring at the land that had once been her home, a quiet resolve began to crystallize in her chest. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. They wanted control of the water. Let them try to explain why the pumps went dry. Let them scramble to find the access code that didn't exist. She knew every inch of this land. She knew its veins, its heartbeat, and every hidden lever it carried. They had taken her home, but they had forgotten the most important thing. Lucia Marsh was still standing on her feet, and she wasn't going anywhere. In that moment, she stopped being a target and became a storm. Lucia's boots crunched through the dried reeds lining the edge of the property as she moved downhill, the key clenched tightly in her hand. The sun was high now, its heat baking the already brittle land, and each step stirred a faint ghost of dust behind her. Her breath was steady but shallow. The numbness she had felt when she first arrived had given way to something colder, harder, a tension that coiled itself through her ribs and tightened each time her mind circled back to what had happened. The image of her house, or rather the absence of it, was burned into her mind. No notice, no calls, no signs of legal order, just the devastating finality of a leveled homestead. It was the kind of violation that went beyond property. It was erasure, deliberate and personal. She reached the clearing by the creek bed and pushed aside the brambles with her gloved hand, ignoring the way the thorns tugged at her sleeves. Beneath the wild vines lay the stone she had nearly forgotten about. Flat, smooth, the size of a cutting board. She dropped to her knees and brushed it clean with her palm, revealing the faint X Charlie had etched into the surface more than 2 decades ago. The hatch beneath wasn't large, only about the width of a feed bin, but it was reinforced steel, sunk deep into concrete. She inserted the key and felt the heavy lock click, then pulled hard. It resisted at first, then creaked open with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a narrow shaft and a steel ladder leading 10 feet down into the dark. The air inside was damp and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat above. Lucia descended carefully, her boots finding each rung by instinct more than sight. At the bottom, her flashlight beam flicked across the concrete tunnel until it landed on the mechanical valve box, a rust-colored beast of a thing with an iron wheel and a simple analog gauge. No digital components. No wireless signals. This was old infrastructure, a relic from a time when things were built to last and required human hands to operate. She knelt beside it and turned the valve 1/4 clockwise. The motion engaged the bypass, diverting the flow of water from the cooperative's primary line back into a holding tank on her property. Or it would have, had the tank still existed. As it was, the move simply starved the upper line, cutting pressure to everything downhill. It wasn't full shutdown, not yet, just enough to get someone's attention. When she climbed back up and sealed the hatch, the sun had shifted westward. The light had a harsher angle now, casting the skeletal remains of her land in longer, crueler shadows. Her truck's radio buzzed with static as she turned the ignition, then switched over to the only AM news station she could still get this deep in the county. She sat with the engine running, listening as local headlines droned on about dry weather, feed shortages, and a town hall meeting on irrigation use scheduled for next week. Nothing about her. Nothing about what had happened here. Of course not. She drove to the county assessor's office in Milstead, 30 minutes away. The office sat in a squat beige building next to a closed laundromat and a faded diner that hadn't served coffee since the pandemic. Inside, the air smelled of toner ink and lemon-scented cleaner, and the woman behind the plexiglass window barely looked up when Lucia approached. "Parcel number?" the clerk asked flatly. Lucia gave it, spelling out each digit carefully. The woman typed it in and frowned slightly. "This one's flagged," she said. "Says there's a pending transition request on the jurisdictional status." Lucia felt her pulse spike. What kind of transition? The woman glanced up, finally meeting her eyes. "Looks like your land was reclassified 3 weeks ago from private residential to agricultural utility corridor. That would explain a lot. Happens sometimes when land is adjacent to shared infrastructure." "Without my consent?" Lucia asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Well, technically it can be done under emergency provisioning if a board deems it essential to local infrastructure needs. You'd have to talk to the district cooperative about that. They're the ones who filed the petition." Lucia clenched her jaw. She thanked the clerk, took the printed summary, and left without another word. She sat in the truck with the paper resting on her knee, her vision narrowing on one line. Petition Initiator. K. Bledsoe, Chair, Eastern District Agricultural Cooperative. Karen. Of course. No signature from Lucia. No registered mail. Just a quiet procedural move made under the radar and rubber-stamped by a complicit board during what was likely a meeting no one outside their circle had even known about. It wasn't a miscommunication. It wasn't bureaucracy. It was calculated. She drove next to the water office, located in a prefab trailer outside of town. A sad, heat-warped thing with its windows taped to keep the AC from leaking. Inside, a young man in a badge-labeled polo shirt looked up from behind a cluttered desk. He smiled too quickly, the way people do when they're trained to handle complaints and already tired of it. "I need to speak to whoever manages emergency line access permissions," Lucia said. He hesitated. "That would be Ms. Bledsoe's department, ma'am. She handles all cooperative-related supply infrastructure. You can file a grievance form." "I'm not here to file a grievance," Lucia said. "I'm here to ask why a mechanical water main running through deeded land was modified without owner consent." The smile faltered. "Are you referring to parcel 287-31? "Yes. There was a line event logged 5 days ago. Pressure drop and a structural failure at a junction valve. They deemed the area unsafe and authorized a clearing for restoration. You should have been notified." "There was no failure," Lucia cut in. "There was no inspection. There was no notice. There was no fire. There was no anything. Just bulldozers." The clerk swallowed. I don't know the specifics. You'd need to... Lucia turned and left. There was nothing more to say. Every person she spoke to was either deflecting or afraid. She wasn't going to waste breath arguing with a system that had already decided she didn't exist. By the time she made it back to the land, the sun was sinking. Her trailer had been looted. Not thoroughly, just opened, rummaged through, things overturned and tossed. Her documents were still there. Her dog was gone. The bowl was overturned and paw prints led into the trees. She called out until her throat was raw, but only the wind answered. She spent an hour searching the tree line with a flashlight and came back empty. Someone had sent a message. Someone wanted her rattled, afraid, alone. Lucia slept in her truck that night, one hand on the wheel, the other on the handle of the old pump-action shotgun Charlie had kept behind the seat since the day they'd moved in. The key to the main valve sat in her pocket. The land might have been stripped bare, the home taken, the systems gutted, but the line still ran under her soil. And as long as she held that, she had leverage. They didn't want her gone. They wanted her silent. They were about to learn the difference. Lucia woke at dawn, her back stiff from the cramped night in the truck cab and the remnants of adrenaline lingering in her chest like stale smoke. The air was cooler now, the early hours casting long shadows across the ground where her house once stood. She slid out of the truck slowly, shotgun still within reach, and stretched with a quiet groan. Nothing had moved during the night, at least not visibly. The clearing was as she had left it, empty, flattened, violated, but something had shifted within her. The grief of what had been taken had begun to settle, harden into purpose. The land was scarred, but the roots were still there. And so was she. Her first move that morning was deliberate. She drove into the next county, not toward the courthouse or another office where paperwork and false politeness would be used to keep her quiet, but to the hardware yard where she and Charlie had once bought fencing supplies and pressure regulators. By the pallet. She didn't ask for help when she got there. She loaded the heavy rolls of barbed wire, 5 new padlocks, 2 50-gallon drums, and several lengths of cast iron piping herself. The store owner, a man named Lyle who had known Charlie back when they all used to drink coffee in the same diner, gave her a look but said nothing. Just rang her up, nodded once, and watched her drive off without offering a word. Word had traveled fast, as it always did out here. Everyone knew something had happened on her land, but no one wanted to stand close enough to get caught in the recoil. Back on her property, she began constructing a perimeter. Not a fence exactly, but a statement. Barbed wire wrapped in tight, defensive coils was anchored to each corner of the flattened foundation, with makeshift braces driven into the ground. She installed 2 of the padlocks on the storage shed and 1 on the entrance gate at the main road, even though she knew locks meant little to the kind of people she was dealing with. Still, it was about optics now, about letting whoever was watching, and she knew someone was, see that she wasn't folding. By midday, she turned her attention to the pipes. These weren't just any fittings. They were the bypass control arms for the water main, the ones Charlie had installed decades ago to allow manual redirection in case of mechanical failure. Most of the newer cooperative systems used automated valves, programmed remotely from central servers, but Charlie never trusted systems he couldn't hear hum or see click. The manual control was buried a few hundred yards south of the main access shaft, camouflaged by scrub brush and a thicket of chokeweed. She hadn't even remembered it existed until the night before, lying in the truck with the key warm in her hand. She spent hours digging through the brush, finally locating the access plate under a rusted length of corrugated steel. The handle was seized with age and grime, but eventually gave way under the leverage of a crowbar. Beneath it was the old control box, still intact, its locking mechanism untouched. She connected the pipe segments and began redirecting the water away from the main cooperative line entirely. The water, instead of feeding into the main junction, now looped into an unused segment of pipe leading east, back toward county land, where it would spill uselessly into a rocky arroyo, away from any practical use. It was wasteful. It was crude. It was absolutely effective. By late afternoon, reports of pressure loss were already making their rounds. She heard them not through news stations or official bulletins, but in the form of pickup trucks crawling past her gate, the drivers rubbernecking as if trying to understand what had gone wrong. One even stopped, a navy blue Dodge she didn't recognize, and sat idle for several minutes before reversing slowly and disappearing back up the road. Lucia made sure her silhouette was visible as she stood beside the truck, just inside her newly coiled perimeter, cleaning the pump-action shotgun like it was just another chore. No one got out. No one said a word. The next encounter was more direct. The following morning, a white SUV pulled up to her gate. It wasn't marked, but she recognized the driver before she saw her face. Karen Bledsoe climbed out slowly, dressed not in her usual denim and boots but in a gray pantsuit, as if pretending she was someone with nothing to hide. Her hair was perfect, her expression unreadable behind large sunglasses. She didn't call out or wave. She simply stood by the locked gate, eyes scanning the coiled wire, the scorched field beyond, and then Lucia herself, who approached with deliberate calm, shotgun still in her hands. Not raised, not aimed, just present. "We need to talk," Karen said, her voice clipped. Lucia stopped 10 feet from the gate. "About what? The trespassing? The destruction of private property? Or the rerouting of county infrastructure without the consent of the landowner?" Karen smiled tightly. "You're angry. I understand. Emotions are high. But this isn't personal. You burned my house to the ground." Karen didn't flinch. It was deemed a structural hazard. The board approved emergency clearance under Article 11. Don't quote me articles. There was no notice, no letter, no posting. You didn't go through the county, because if you had, I'd have had a sheriff at my gate, not bulldozers in the night. Karen's smile turned brittle. "We didn't anticipate the escalation. We thought you'd understand the urgency. The water main is essential infrastructure. It runs through my land. It runs through all of ours. We all have to share resources. I never denied access." Karen exhaled. "That's not how the board sees it." Lucia stepped closer to the gate. "Then the board needs new eyes." Karen's jaw twitched. "If you don't restore flow, there will be consequences. Not threats. Real ones. Legal ones. You can't block the district's supply." "I can if you accessed it illegally, which you did. And I'm not blocking it. I'm redirecting it. Big difference." Karen took a step back. "You'll regret this." "No, Karen," Lucia said, voice level. "You will." Karen turned and got back in her SUV without another word. The tires spun gravel as she drove off, and Lucia stood there watching her disappear in a cloud of dust, heart hammering but hands steady. It was official now. No more pretending. No more forms or visits. The gloves were off. That night, Lucia didn't sleep in the truck. She sat by the access hatch with a lantern and a pair of bolt cutters, listening to the stillness. Around midnight, she heard movement in the trees. Faint, deliberate, cautious. Not animals, not locals. 2 figures, crouched and hooded, made their way to the creek bed and circled the hatch. She watched, unmoving as they examined the lock, whispered briefly, and began unpacking tools. Lucia clicked off the lantern and stepped into the clearing with the shotgun raised and the bolt halfway drawn. "One warning," she called into the dark. "After that, I won't be polite." The figures froze. One of them dropped a bag. The other cursed under his breath. Then, just as silently, they turned and vanished into the trees. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't need to. The war had started. They were testing her, probing for weakness. And she had just shown them what happened when they pushed too far. The days that followed the failed midnight intrusion passed with a strange, quiet intensity. Lucia didn't wait for another confrontation. She had no intention of playing defense for the rest of her life. The message she had sent with that shotgun in the dark had landed, but it was just that. A message. Temporary. She needed something more permanent. Something not just to scare them, but to tie their hands and bury them in the same bureaucracy they thought would protect them. She started by organizing everything. Every receipt for material she had purchased since the demolition. Every photograph she had taken of the flattened home, the scorched patches of earth, the disconnected wiring, the burnt remains of the filtration tank. Every printout of public records, property surveys, tax assessments, and waterline schematics. She filled 3 folders, labeled each by hand, and locked them in a small portable safe, which she stored in the frame of her trailer under a false floor panel Charlie had built decades ago. She scanned everything, too, and uploaded it to cloud storage using the limited satellite hotspot she could still access from the edge of the hill where cell service flickered. Then she called Evelyn Santos. Evelyn wasn't a friend. She wasn't even someone Lucia particularly liked, but she was precise, ruthless, and unshakable. A former compliance officer who had moved out west after burning a state contractor in a procurement scandal, Evelyn now ran a niche consulting outfit that specialized in rural infrastructure auditing. She didn't do favors. She didn't work for sympathy. But she respected leverage, and Lucia had it. Lucia didn't ask her to investigate. She didn't ask her to expose Karen or take down the district board. She asked her to do one thing: follow the water. Evelyn arrived 2 days later, driving a dusty white sedan with the windows tinted and the license plate half obscured by mud. She wore no badge, carried no briefcase, and introduced herself with a flat, "Let's get started." For 48 hours, they worked without rest. Evelyn mapped every segment of pipe that ran through Lucia's land. She used sensors and digital scopes, cross-referenced with soil composition data and topographical maps. What she found confirmed Lucia's suspicions, but the full scale still shocked her. Multiple bypass lines had been illegally installed beneath the edge of Lucia's property. At least 2 of them connected directly to unregistered livestock operations downstream. The fittings were crude but effective, installed by contractors who clearly knew what they were doing. The systems had been tapping into the water line for over a year, siphoning pressure and creating phantom drops that the cooperative used as justification for seizing land rights. More damning than the bypasses themselves were the paper trails Evelyn uncovered. District maintenance logs signed off by names that no longer existed in any personnel database, project invoices sent to shell companies, approvals authorized by subcommittees that had never held public meetings. It was a network of intentional opacity, carefully constructed to avoid scrutiny, but Evelyn wasn't looking to blow the whistle. That wasn't her style. She wanted to turn the system against itself. "You don't need the courts," she said quietly one night as they sat under the stars, sipping from tin mugs of bitter coffee. "You need the insurance companies and the USDA." Lucia looked at her, skeptical. "You think they'll care?" "They don't care about you, but they care about misuse of federal resources. They care about unauthorized infrastructure on grant-supported land, and they care about fraud. Especially when it impacts water allocation." The next morning, Evelyn filed 3 anonymous reports through her encrypted network. One with the Department of Agriculture's Resource Division, another with the Environmental Compliance Office, and a third with a private agricultural insurer tied to the Eastern District's livestock pool. She attached the scanned maps, redacted survey results, and time-stamped logs. Then she packed her equipment, handed Lucia a sealed envelope containing hard copies of all her findings, and left without a goodbye. 2 days later, the shift began. Lucia noticed it first in the silence. The trucks stopped driving past her property. The calls from friendly board members offering to negotiate ceased. Even Karen's shadow seemed to recede. But, more than that, it was the absence of movement on the co-op land that told Lucia the fire had caught. The irrigation fields, once buzzing with activity, now stood still. The workers were gone. The temporary fencing had been dismantled. Portable tanks, previously used to supplement the line, had been pulled. Something had made them nervous. That night, Lucia drove into Milstead again, this time to the library, the only public building with a wired computer system strong enough to download full reports. From there, she accessed the public federal contractor database. And there it was, a formal USDA field audit scheduled for the cooperative lands within the week, flagged under suspicion of grant misappropriation and unsanctioned infrastructure expansion. Lucia sat back in the chair, her chest rising slowly. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the scale had shifted. She had moved the conflict from the shadows to the records, from vandalism and threats to compliance and fraud. It would take time, and the cooperative would no doubt fight back with every legal trick they had, but the real damage had already been done. The moment Karen and her allies had reached into Lucia's land to seize control of the water, they had crossed a line far bigger than they realized. Not a personal line, not even a moral one, but a federal one. The board might survive the scandal. The contractors might walk away untouched, but the pipelines they installed without authorization would have to be dismantled. The siphoning would end, and with it, their monopoly. Lucia didn't smile as she walked back to her truck that night. She didn't feel joy. Only clarity. She hadn't wanted this fight. She hadn't sought it. But they had assumed her silence was surrender. Now they would learn the difference. The winds shifted again. Not in temperature, not in scent, but in tone. The kind of shift you couldn't see but could feel, like the atmosphere had grown taut, heavy with something unspoken. After Evelyn left, Lucia didn't expect calm. Far from it. She knew the silence wasn't surrender, but recalibration. Karen and her allies weren't the type to respond with direct retaliation when heat was on them from above. They had other tools, other channels, and now, more than ever, they had something else. Desperation. And desperate people in power were the most dangerous kind. Lucia maintained her routine, outwardly unshaken. She patrolled her land at dawn and dusk, checked the control valves, recorded gauge readings by hand. She doubled her locks, replaced the padlocks with industrial-grade clasp systems, and wired motion-triggered alarms at key points. They weren't connected to any external system. She wasn't about to risk infiltration, but each had a piercing, shrill battery horn that would make silence impossible for miles if tripped. She slept in intervals now, boots on, gun nearby, eating little, saying less. It began, as she suspected, not with action, but with rumor. The co-op, through subtle, well-placed suggestions, began feeding the surrounding landowners narratives that Lucia had rerouted critical water supply to spite the community, that she was unstable, grieving, paranoid, lashing out at people who only wanted cooperation. The lies weren't shouted, only whispered, in farm supply stores after Sunday service, in line at the feed mill. The kind of soft erosion that didn't provoke rebuttal but seeded doubt. Lucia could see it in the way people looked at her, or didn't. Neighbors she had known for years suddenly refused eye contact. At the co-op station downtown, she was asked, politely, to fill her gas cans outside. Her invoices at the supply store started including convenience charges. At the diner, her usual table was reserved. It wasn't confrontation. It was coordinated coldness. Then the attacks started. Not overt, Not in your face, but precise. Her trailer, parked beneath the edge of the tree line, was targeted first. One morning, she returned from the creek path to find the solar panel array shattered, each unit smashed with what appeared to be a steel rod. No footprints, no tire tracks. They'd come on foot at night, likely from the back ridge. That same day, she discovered 3 of her reserve water containers, steel drums she'd placed behind the shed, were missing. No drag marks, just gone. A week later, the gate chain was cut clean. Not twisted, not snapped. Cut. Industrial shears. Whoever did it wanted her to know they were willing to walk onto her land and act, regardless of locks or warnings. She replaced it, this time with hardened steel cable wrapped through cinder blocks. But the next night they came again. The alarm blared at 2:43 a.m., and by the time she grabbed the shotgun and lantern and reached the main road, she found only an oil-soaked rag hanging from the gate post and fresh tracks. Not boots, but off-road treads. They were scouting. She documented everything. She reported nothing. Lucia knew better than to rely on local law enforcement. The sheriff's office had remained conspicuously silent since the beginning. Every message she'd sent, every complaint she filed, was met with some version of outside our jurisdiction, civil matter, or worse, total non-response. She wasn't waiting on a badge to defend her land. So she turned to the last thing they hadn't touched, the old power junction box Charlie had built 30 years ago, tucked beneath a grove of pines on the northeast boundary. The box controlled more than just a few exterior lights. It was the junction for the backup water system, gravity-fed lines installed before the cooperative ever existed, before electronic valves and remote sensors. It used old pipe, outdated regulators, and a simple lever system that could reroute pressure flow to half the region if activated. Charlie had disconnected it when the cooperative brought in their tech-heavy upgrades, but he never removed it. He had called it the kill switch, back when they were still part of the network. Lucia hadn't touched it in over a decade. She opened the box with shaking hands. The internal components were dusty but intact. The switches stiff but responsive. It was all manual. Physical toggles, analog gauges, nothing a remote command could intercept. She toggled 2 lines closed and engaged the third, redirecting the flow from her segment of pipe directly into the waste channel, a gravel trench miles away, one the co-op had never maintained because they'd assumed control was permanent. By morning, the entire southern livestock corridor, Karen's pride and joy, had gone dry. What followed wasn't just panic, it was chaos. Dozens of water tankers began pouring down rural roads, coordinated with frantic calls to the few private well operators still functioning. A livestock emergency was declared on private radio channels, and temporary bypass pumps were dragged across fields like lifeboats. Drone footage, the kind that nobody admitted existed, began appearing on regional feed forums showing cracked troughs, distressed cattle, bone-dry irrigation lines. Farmers who had previously supported the board now demanded answers. Where had the emergency backups gone? Why was the infrastructure dependent on one landowner's cooperation if that landowner had never signed over control? The board responded with urgency and fury. But they made one critical mistake. They filed for an injunction. Lucia received the summons hand-delivered by a man in a crisp suit and dusty boots. She accepted the envelope, thanked him, and closed the door. Inside, she read it twice. The cooperative was demanding immediate court-ordered access to all infrastructure running through her land, citing willful interference with essential agricultural supply systems, malicious disruption of district resources, and, most laughably, an illegal modification of communal utilities. She called a lawyer that evening, not a local, not even in-state, but a land rights litigator she found through a university agricultural journal that Charlie used to subscribe to. The woman's name was Maeve Carson. She answered on the third ring, listened without interrupting, and said 3 words Lucia would never forget. Send everything. Now. Lucia faxed documents, emailed scanned maps, even overnighted the field audit Evelyn had produced, along with a USB stick containing encrypted footage of the valve work, the unauthorized bypass evidence, and the vandalism logs. By the next day, Maeve had filed a motion to dismiss the injunction, not just to fight it, but to counterclaim under state trespassing statutes, unlawful seizure, and damages related to agricultural sabotage. And the court, to Lucia's astonishment, didn't just accept the motion, they fast-tracked it. When the board realized the countersuit was moving faster than their original injunction, they panicked. Karen sent an emissary, a former board member, a man named Trent, who once helped Charlie build a new shed after a windstorm. He came with his hat in hand and a folder under one arm, asking for a reasonable path forward. Lucia let him speak all the way through his rehearsed apology, his vague promises of community healing, his half-admissions about the water lines. When he finished, she handed him a single-page letter. It was signed, notarized, and certified. A formal notice of revocation of all access to subsurface resources by any cooperative contractor under penalty of trespass. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm not," she replied. "And if you come back, bring your lawyer, because next time I won't be issuing paper, I'll be filing liens." He left pale, clutching the letter like it might explode. In the weeks that followed, everything accelerated. The USDA launched an in-person audit. Their investigators arrived without warning, photographing, surveying, asking direct questions at the co-op office that left staff stumbling. The insurance group, tipped off by Evelyn's complaint, began re-evaluating the cooperative's coverage. Suddenly, the board was facing more than one angry landowner. They were staring down the barrel of financial collapse. Karen, for all her bravado, began to fade. Her public statements became rare. Her presence at board meetings delegated. Rumors spread that she'd been asked to step down pending review. No one said the word corruption. They didn't have to. Lucia kept to her land, watching it all unfold from the hilltop like a hawk. She didn't celebrate. She didn't speak to the press, who had finally caught wind of something worth noticing. She didn't forgive. She waited, because the fight wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The courthouse in Monroe County didn't look like a battlefield. From the outside, it was just another pale-bricked government building with mismatched windows and a roof in need of new shingles. But on the morning of Lucia Marsh's hearing, it had the electric undercurrent of a place bracing for collision. Parked trucks lined the curb for 3 blocks. Their windows rolled halfway down in the heavy heat, engines ticking as they cooled. People weren't there to support her. Not really. They were there to witness what everyone privately admitted was an impossible thing. One woman dragging the Agricultural District Board, and by extension the entire cooperative power structure, into court and not immediately getting crushed beneath it. Lucia arrived early, not to perform or grandstand, but because she had no intention of walking into that courtroom like a defendant. She wore a simple gray shirt tucked into black jeans, her silver hair tied tightly at the back of her neck, her boots polished and silent on the tile. She carried a single leather folder, worn but clean, containing every essential document Maeve Carson said they'd need: land deed, survey charts, the USDA compliance flag report, and the counterclaim submission. She didn't need volume. She needed precision. Across the hall, Karen Bledsoe stood flanked by 2 men in stiff navy suits and a younger woman whose expression was a mask of performative neutrality. Karen looked smaller than Lucia remembered. Not physically, but diminished, stripped of the untouchable smugness that had once accompanied her every public move. Her hair was immaculate as ever, her blouse expensive, but her eyes darted with the caution of someone who could no longer guarantee her own story would be the only one told. Inside the courtroom, Lucia sat beside Maeve, who had flown in that morning and wasted no time making her presence felt. She didn't charm the room or smile at the judge. She delivered her opening remarks with the cold sharpness of someone who understood rural systems as infrastructure, not folklore, who knew where policy ended and violation began. The judge, a man in his 60s with a clean bench record and a reputation for exacting fairness, leaned forward often, eyebrows raised, taking notes faster than the clerk could type. The cooperative's team opened by framing Lucia as a disruptive force, a property owner allegedly hoarding a vital resource and interfering with community distribution. They spoke of emergency conditions, the drought, the need for swift action. They implied, but did not directly state, that Lucia's resistance had endangered the health of livestock and possibly public safety. They referenced her refusal to cooperate and painted her actions as emotionally driven, untethered to logic or shared values. Maeve waited. She let them speak. Then, when the courtroom paused, she stood, walked directly to the central monitor, and began displaying evidence. Clean, orderly, devastating. First came the original land deed, clearly marking not only the surface rights but subsurface easements exclusive to the property owner. Then the waterline control diagrams, submitted and signed by the board years ago, recognizing Lucia's plot as the final access point before districts split. Then photos of unauthorized fittings, pipe bypasses, and valves not listed in any formal co-op record, all buried under Lucia's land without a single documented permit. Next came the USDA audit findings, highlighting misallocated federal funds for infrastructure upgrades never completed, and the insurance fraud warning tied to uninspected system expansions. By the time Maeve was halfway through, the judge had begun to scowl. He interrupted twice, once to clarify the lack of property notice prior to demolition, and again to confirm that no formal inspection had occurred before the board acted on imminent hazard claims. Both answers, reluctantly offered by the co-op attorneys, were either vague or outright absent. And then Maeve delivered the final blow. Video surveillance footage, pulled from a hidden trail camera Lucia had installed weeks before the demolition. One she had never mentioned to anyone. The grainy footage showed two trucks, one clearly bearing district contractor insignia, arriving on Lucia's property after dusk. Men stepped out with bolt cutters, power tools, and fuel cans. The camera didn't catch faces, but it captured sequence, intention, and method. It removed all plausible deniability. Karen's composure cracked visibly. Her lips tightened, fingers clenched around a pen she didn't write with. One of her lawyers leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't respond. The judge watched her, then slowly leaned back in his chair. "I've seen enough," he said. The room fell into stillness, not silence. The air conditioner still buzzed, the court reporter's keys still clicked, but a kind of psychological halt, the moment when narrative collapses and fact asserts dominance. The judge didn't issue a full ruling that day. He ordered a halt to all cooperative activity involving Lucia's land and initiated a formal investigation into the district's infrastructure expansion practices. He confirmed the validity of Lucia's countersuit for trespassing and unlawful seizure. He didn't slam the gavel. He didn't need to. His tone was final, his words heavy enough to shift the room's center of gravity. Outside the courthouse, reporters hovered. Not many, but enough. Lucia ignored them. She didn't give a statement. She didn't need to. The story was no longer hers to carry. The papers had been filed. The evidence was in the public record. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was victory. That night, she returned to her land. She walked the perimeter again, the flashlight steady in her hand, every wire intact, every lock unbroken. The pumps were still silent, the old control box untouched. Her dog, missing for over a week, limped out from the edge of the woods, muddy and thin but alive. Lucia dropped to her knees beside him, hands trembling as she checked him for injury, and for the first time in days, she let her breath break free. Not a sob, not joy. Just breath. Deep, hard, earned. From the hilltop, she watched the distance. The co-op fields were still dark, the trucks quiet. No patrols, no lights, just stillness. But she wasn't waiting anymore. The court had paused the machine. The regulators were coming. The contracts were unraveling. Her land, once thought lost, was now a fault line, and she was its anchor. They had raised her home, but they had not broken her ground. Not her will, not her fight. And now she had the upper hand. Weeks passed, and with them the summer began to bend into something quieter. The air no longer smelled of dry grass and dust, but of turned soil and cooling wind. The fields to the south, once choked with tanker trucks and activity, had grown still. A few scattered attempts were made to restart the operations, but each one was stymied by paperwork, by inspections, by the simple weight of scrutiny. Oh, what had once been an untouchable structure, the Eastern District's cooperative authority, now moved with caution, every decision double-checked, every transaction recorded. Their grip was broken, not by force, but by exposure. Lucia never returned to court. Maeve handled the settlement negotiations with the methodical detachment of someone who had already won. The cooperative made no formal apology. Of course they didn't. But they withdrew all claims against her land, agreed to a structured payout for damages, and, more importantly, relinquished any future easement claims on her property. That document, signed and certified by both sides, was framed and mounted above the rebuilt entry gate to her land. It was the only thing she allowed herself to hang. The rest she kept practical, clean, unadorned. She didn't rebuild the house. Not as it had been. There was no point recreating a ghost. Instead, she used part of the settlement money to bring in a local builder, someone unaffiliated with the board, to construct a modest cabin further up the ridge, overlooking the creek and the line they had once fought over. It was efficient, tight, built from reclaimed lumber and steel siding. Nothing extravagant. But it was hers. The bedroom faced the sunrise. The front window opened toward the valley. And every morning, Lucia woke to silence. Not the uneasy kind that preceded confrontation, but the earned kind that followed it. The land began to breathe again. Birds returned. Rabbits dug back into the brush near the fence line. The creek ran clean. Her dog, now recovered, took up his old patrol routes, tail high, ears twitching with each passing shadow. Lucia planted vegetables near the eastern wall and installed a rain catchment system that fed a small irrigation row. Not to make a statement, not to claim victory, but simply because she could. There was peace in utility, in function, in knowing that she no longer lived at someone else's mercy. As for Karen Bledsoe, she disappeared from public view. Word spread that she had quietly resigned from the board after the audit confirmed multiple ethics violations and the loss of critical USDA funding. A new committee formed, smaller, more transparent, filled with names Lucia didn't know and didn't care to. They sent her a letter, months later, asking if she would consider attending one of their open forums. As a respected stakeholder. She folded it in half and used it as kindling the next morning. Occasionally, someone from town would drive by her property, slow down near the gate and sit idling for a moment, as if trying to see the place where it had all happened. But no one came up the road. No one crossed the line. Respect, it seemed, had finally been learned. Lucia didn't boast. She didn't retell the story to strangers or hang plaques in her new home. But when she looked out over the land in the late hours, after the sun had gone and the stars settled above the dark treetops, she felt the shift, not just in the soil, but in herself. There was no triumph, no fire left in her chest, only the calm clarity of someone who had withstood a storm and did not bend. She was older now. Leaner, less interested in forgiveness, more committed to presence. Her home had been razed, her trust violated, but she had survived, and not just endured, but defined the terms of her existence again. And in the quiet, beneath the wind, beside the creek that still carried water through the same soil they had once tried to claim, Lucia Marsh stood alone, unbroken, unbought, and absolutely, irrevocably in control.